I'm too young to handle this. The 19-year-old giant, mail-order bride, sobbed to the 70-year-old rancher who'd bought her, but by morning she was begging him never to stop. The 19-year-old mail-order bride knelt in the dusty Montana soil before the 70-year-old rancher who'd bought her, her trembling hands reaching for his belt as the morning sun cast long shadows across the isolated ranch. Aurelia May Winters, in her white wedding dress, dark eyes lifted to meet the weathered face of Josiah Bear Thornton, the giant who now owned her by law and contract. "I'm too young to handle this," she'd sobbed just hours before, backing away from him in their wedding night bedroom, her whole body shaking with the crushing weight of what she'd become. Purchased property, a transaction, a 19-year-old girl sold to a 70-year-old stranger whose calloused hands and battle-scarred body terrified her. The rancher had stood there in the lamplight, his jaw clenched tight as he watched her panic, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow the room, but instead of taking what the $300 contract had promised him, instead of claiming the rights he'd paid for, Josiah Thornton had turned away and walked out into the cold Montana night, leaving her alone. But to understand how she'd ended up on her knees begging this man for something she couldn't name, you had to go back 12 hours, back to when the stagecoach had first rattled up that dusty road carrying a terrified girl who'd sold herself to escape a fate worse than death. Aurelia had pressed her face against the coach window, watching the Montana wilderness roll past, endless plains of golden grass, mountains that scraped the sky, and not a single soul for miles. Her stomach had twisted with every mile that took her farther from Missouri, farther from everything she'd known. The other passengers had stared at her Mexican features, her olive skin and dark hair, whispering behind their hands. She'd clutched the marriage contract in her lap, the paper that had cost her everything and promised her nothing except survival. The loan shark back in Missouri had given her two choices after her father drank himself to death and left her with debts she could never pay. Work in his brothel servicing miners and railroad men until her body gave out, or sign the mail-order bride contract and disappear into the frontier. She'd chosen the contract, choosing one man over hundreds, choosing Montana over slow destruction. But as the stagecoach pulled up to the Thornton Ranch, and she saw him for the first time, this mountain of a man with silver hair and shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, terror had seized her heart. He was 70 years old enough to be her grandfather, old enough to have fought in wars she'd only heard stories about. Josiah had stood on the porch of his ranch house, absolutely still, watching her climb down from the coach with her single worn trunk. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, deep set in a face carved by decades of sun and wind, and something darker. Scars ran along his jaw and disappeared into his collar. His hands, massive and scarred, had hung at his sides like weapons he'd forgotten how to use. When he'd spoken, his voice had been rough as gravel. "Miss Winters, I'm Josiah Thornton. Welcome to your new home." Not a question, not a greeting, a statement of ownership. The preacher from Redemption Ridge had married them right there in the dirt yard. No ceremony, no music, just words spoken over the wind while ranch hands watched from the corral. Aurelia had felt their eyes on her, judging, calculating what this Mexican girl was worth to their boss. When Josiah had slipped the ring on her finger, a simple gold band, too large, spinning loose, she'd wanted to run. But there was nowhere to go, no family, no money, no home but this. The preacher had said, "You may kiss your bride," and Josiah had hesitated, then pressed his lips to her forehead like she was something fragile he was afraid to break. That tenderness had confused her more than violence would have. Dinner had been silent, just the two of them at opposite ends of a long wooden table. Aurelia had pushed food around her plate, unable to eat, unable to look at him. The house was beautiful in a rough way. Hand-hewn logs, stone fireplace, fur rugs on the floor. Everything built by his hands over 40 years alone. She'd felt the weight of that loneliness pressing down on the rooms like a physical thing. When darkness fell and he'd stood, extending his hand to lead her to the bedroom, her whole body had started shaking. This was it. This was the moment she'd been sold for. The bedroom had been simple. A massive bed covered in quilts, a window looking out at mountains turned purple in the twilight, a lamp casting golden light across rough wooden walls. Josiah had closed the door behind them, and the sound of it shutting had felt like a coffin lid slamming. He'd started unbuttoning his shirt, and that's when she'd seen them, the scars. They covered his chest and arms like a roadmap of violence, bullet holes, knife wounds, a brand mark burned into his ribs that looked like it had been done with a hot iron. She'd gasped, covering her mouth, and something in his eyes had died. "I know what I look like," he had said quietly, his fingers freezing on the buttons. "I know what you see. An old man. A monster. Someone who bought you because no woman would have him otherwise." His voice had cracked. "But I paid for you fair and square. The contract says, I'm too young to handle this." The words had burst from Aurelia's throat like a scream, tears streaming down her face. "I'm 19 years old, and I'm standing here like cattle you purchased, and I can't just—" She'd backed against the wall, her whole body trembling. "You don't know me. You don't love me. I'm just a thing you bought to cook your meals and warm your bed, and I can't breathe. I can't do this. I'm too young to give up every dream I ever had." She'd slid down the wall, sobbing into her hands, everything pouring out. Her father's death, the debts, the loan shark's hands on her face, telling her how pretty she'd look in his brothel, the desperate choice to sign away her life to a stranger. "I'm not even a person anymore," she'd whispered. "I'm just property, just a Mexican girl nobody wanted who got sold to an old man nobody wants." Josiah had stood there frozen, his shirt half unbuttoned, his scarred chest exposed, his face working through emotions she couldn't name. Then he'd done something that stopped her breath. He'd buttoned his shirt back up, walked to the closet, pulled out a blanket and pillow. "You're wrong about one thing," he'd said, his voice thick. "You're not property. You're a person who deserves better than this, better than me." He'd walked to the door. "This is your room tonight. I'll sleep in the barn." "But the contract—" "To hell with the contract!" He'd looked back at her, and in his storm-gray eyes she'd seen something that made her chest ache. "I bought you because I'm a selfish old fool who couldn't stand one more night alone in this house, but I won't compound that sin by taking something you're not ready to give. Sleep. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." He'd walked out, closing the door gently behind him. Aurelia had sat there on the floor, stunned, listening to his heavy footsteps cross the porch and fade toward the barn. Then she'd heard other sounds, the creak of the barn door, the scrape of something being dragged. And then, cutting through the Montana night, a sound that shattered every wall she'd built around her heart, the deep broken sobs of a 70-year-old man who'd spent 40 years alone, who'd paid $300 for companionship, and who'd just walked away from the only warmth he'd purchased because he couldn't bear to see her cry. Aurelia had lain in that bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to sounds from the barn that haunted her like ghosts. The rhythmic scrape of metal on wood, steady, determined, despite the cold that must have been seeping into his old bones. Every few minutes the scraping would stop, and she'd hear a sharp intake of breath, a low groan that told her his hands were hurting, that whatever he was doing was costing him pain. And beneath it all, every so often, she'd hear it again. That quiet weeping, so soft he probably thought the distance and darkness would hide it. She'd pulled the quilts up to her chin, feeling the warmth he'd given up to sleep in the freezing barn. The bed smelled like cedar and leather and something indefinably masculine that made her chest tight. This was supposed to be their wedding night. She was supposed to be lying here terrified while he took what he'd paid for. Instead, she was alone, safe, listening to him suffer in the cold because he'd chosen her dignity over his own comfort. It made no sense. Men didn't do that. Her father had sold her to pay his debts. The loan shark had tried to force her into prostitution. The stagecoach driver had touched her waist too familiarly when helping her down. Every man she'd ever known had taken what he wanted without asking. But Josiah Thornton had walked away. Around midnight, unable to bear it anymore, Aurelia had risen and crept to the window. The barn was just a dark shape against the star-filled sky, but lamplight glowed through the cracks in the walls. She could see his shadow moving inside, bent over something, working with an intensity that made her throat tight. What was he doing out there? What could be so important that he'd carve wood in the freezing darkness instead of sleeping? The next sound had nearly broken her. His voice, so quiet she almost missed it, speaking words she couldn't quite make out. Then she'd realized. He was praying. This giant of a man, this scarred rancher who looked like he could break her in half with those massive hands, was on his knees in a freezing barn, praying. She'd pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and cried silently, not understanding the emotions tearing through her chest. When dawn finally came, painting the Montana sky in shades of rose and gold, Aurelia had risen and dressed in her wedding gown, the only nice thing she owned. Her hands had shaken as she'd braided her dark hair, secured it with the small silver comb her mother had left her. She'd looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the girl staring back. 24 hours ago, she'd been property being shipped west. Now she was a wife who'd spent her wedding night alone while her husband carved wood in the cold and wept for reasons she didn't understand. She'd walked across the yard as the sun broke over the mountains, her white dress catching the golden light, the frost crunching under her feet. The barn door stood slightly ajar. She'd pushed it open slowly, not sure what she'd find. The smell hit her first, fresh-cut cedar, lamp oil, and underneath it the scent of him, earthy and real. Then she'd seen him. Josiah sat on a hay bale, his broad shoulders slumped with exhaustion, his silver hair falling across his forehead. Wood shavings covered the ground around him like snow. His hands rested on his knees, swollen and red from hours of work, the knuckles raw. On the workbench in front of him sat the most beautiful thing Aurelia had ever seen. A jewelry box carved from cedar, every inch of it covered in intricate designs, flowers, vines, and worked into the pattern so subtle you had to look close to see it, the image of a bird breaking free from a cage. But it was the papers beside the box that made her knees weak. Legal documents, written in his careful, sloping handwriting by lamplight, while his arthritic hands screamed. She'd stepped closer, picked them up with shaking fingers, and read words that changed everything. I, Josiah Thornton, do hereby grant Aurelia May Winters full ownership of 50% of the Thornton Ranch, including all lands, buildings, livestock, and assets, effective immediately. This grant is irrevocable and independent of our marriage contract. Furthermore, I hereby release Aurelia May Winters from any and all obligations under our marriage contract. She is free to leave at any time, with full ownership of her share of this property, and I shall have no legal or moral claim to prevent her departure or to demand any recompense. Her hands had trembled so badly the papers rattled. He'd given her half his ranch, the empire he'd built over 40 years, and he'd given her freedom to walk away. The $300 he'd paid, the contract that bound her, he'd torn it all up and replaced it with a gift that made her an equal partner instead of purchased property. Why? The word had come out as a whisper. Josiah had looked up slowly, and in the morning light she'd seen the exhaustion in his face, the redness around his eyes that told her he'd cried himself out. Because you were right, he'd said, his voice rough as gravel. You're not property, you're a person, a young woman with dreams and a whole life ahead of her, and I'm a selfish old fool who thought he could buy companionship the way he buys cattle. He'd gestured at the papers. Those make it right. You own half this place now. You can stay and we'll figure out how to live as partners, or you can sell your half and leave with enough money to start over anywhere you want. Free. You spent the whole night, Aurelia's voice had broken. Your hands are bleeding. Arthritis, he'd said simply. Had it for years. Gets worse in the cold. But I needed you to know. Needed you to have something beautiful. Something that wasn't a transaction. That box took me 6 months to make. Started it when I first sent for a bride before I knew who'd answer the advertisement. Wanted her to have something made with care, even if I couldn't give her love. Aurelia had lifted the lid of the cedar box with shaking hands. Inside, nestled on blue velvet, lay a gold ring, delicate, beautiful, clearly made for a woman's hand. Not the oversized band he'd put on her finger yesterday. This was different. That was my first wife's wedding ring, Josiah had said quietly. She died 40 years ago, along with our son. Childbirth took them both. His voice had cracked. I've worn my grief-like armor ever since, pushing everyone away, building this ranch as a monument to loneliness. When my hands started failing, when I realized I was going to die, alone in this house I built for a family that never was, I got desperate. Sent for a bride like a coward, thinking I could purchase what I'd spent 40 years being too broken to earn. He'd stood, towering over her even with exhaustion, bowing his shoulders. I won't blame you if you leave, Aurelia. Look at me. I'm 70 years old. My body's failing. I'm scarred, inside and out, from a war that ended before you were born. I've got nothing to offer a young woman except this land and a house full of ghosts. But if you stay, if you choose to stay, it won't be as property. It'll be as a partner, and I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to deserve that gift. Something had broken open in Aurelia's chest, a dam she didn't know she'd built. This man had bought her, yes. But then he'd given her everything, freedom, property, choice. He'd spent a freezing night carving her a symbol of liberation while his arthritic hands bled. He'd wept not because he'd been denied what he'd paid for, but because he'd seen her pain and recognized his own selfishness. She'd looked down at the papers, at the jewelry box, at the ring that represented a love so deep he'd carried it for 40 years. Then she'd looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, not at his age or his scars or the transaction that had brought her here, at him, at the man who'd walked away from his wedding night to give her peace, who'd sacrificed comfort for her dignity, who'd literally carved freedom with bleeding hands. "Teach me," she'd whispered, setting the papers down carefully. "Show me who you are, why you did this, what happened to you that made you build walls 40 years high." She'd stepped closer, her heart pounding. "I don't want to leave, Josiah. I want to understand." His storm-gray eyes had widened. "You're young. I could run back to Missouri and end up in that brothel anyway when the money runs out," she'd interrupted. "Or I could stay here with a man who just gave me more respect in one night than every other man in my life combined." She'd reached for his swollen hands, gasping at how hot they were, how the joints were inflamed and angry. "Let me help you. My mother taught me remedies before she died, herbs that ease pain." "Your mother was from Santa Fe," Aurelia had said, lifting her chin. "Mexican, like me. She taught me healing before my father's drinking killed her spirit." She'd met his eyes. "I saw how the town looked at me yesterday, how your ranch hands stared. They think you bought yourself an exotic pet, someone beneath you." "You're not beneath anyone," Josiah had growled, and the fierce protectiveness in his voice had sent heat through her body. "Anyone who thinks, then show me," she'd challenged. "Show me I'm not property, not a pet, not a transaction. Show me why a man who could have just taken what he paid for chose to bleed in a barn instead." She'd stepped closer, close enough to smell the cedar and leather and exhaustion on him. "Teach me about you, Josiah Thornton, and maybe I'll teach you about me." He'd stared at her like she was a miracle he couldn't trust, his scarred hands trembling in hers. "I don't deserve... Maybe we both deserve better than what life gave us," she'd whispered. "Maybe that's why we're here." And that's when she'd done it, sunk to her knees in the dusty barn floor, her white wedding dress spreading around her like a flower, her hands reaching for his belt. Not from obligation, but from a desperate need to show him she was choosing this, choosing him, claiming what he'd been too honorable to take. "Wait!" Josiah's voice had cracked like thunder, his massive hands catching hers before she could unbuckle his belt. "Aurelia, stop! Not like this." He'd pulled her to her feet with a gentleness that shouldn't have been possible from hands that large, that scarred. "Not on your knees, not as some kind of payment or gratitude. That's not what I want from you." "Then what do you want?" She'd searched his face, confused and aching and feeling something dangerous building in her chest. "You paid for me. You could have taken me last night and no one would have blamed you. The law says I'm yours, but you walked away. You bled for me. You gave me freedom. What do you want, Josiah?" He'd stood there, this 70-year-old giant with silver hair and storm-gray eyes, looking at her like she was the first sunrise he'd seen in 40 years. "I want you to know me first," he'd said quietly. "I want you to understand what you're choosing before you choose it. Because once you know, once you really see what I am, you might take those papers and run, and I wouldn't blame you one bit." Aurelia had felt her pulse pounding in her throat. "Then show me." Josiah had hesitated, then slowly, painfully, he'd unbuttoned his shirt. The lamplight had caught every scar as he pulled the fabric away. Bullet wounds that should have killed him, knife slashes that had carved through muscle, the brand on his ribs that looked like it had been pressed there by a red-hot iron in the shape of letters she couldn't read. His chest was a roadmap of violence, his arms covered in white lines where skin had been opened and stitched back together, rough. "I was 18 when the Civil War started," he'd said, his voice distant. "Signed up with the Union Army because I believed in the cause, fought for 4 years, killed more men than I can count." He'd touched the brand on his ribs. "Got captured by Confederate forces in '63. They did this to mark me as a traitor. Spent 6 months in a prison camp where they beat us daily and fed us slop that wouldn't satisfy a dog. Lost half my weight, watched men die of disease and starvation and cruelty." Aurelia had pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "When the war ended, I came west to forget," Josiah had continued. "Met a woman named Rebecca. She was kind, patient, saw past the nightmares that woke me screaming. We married and she got pregnant and I thought I could build something clean, something good." His voice had broken. "But childbirth took her, took our son. I held him for 10 minutes before he stopped breathing, buried them both on the hill behind this house." He'd looked at Aurelia with eyes full of 40 years of grief. "I built this ranch as a monument to them. Worked myself half to death because physical pain was easier than feeling anything else. Pushed away every person who tried to get close. The whole town thinks I'm crazy. They call me Bear because I'm big and mean and live alone in the wilderness." He'd pulled his shirt back on with shaking hands. "That's who you'd be choosing, Aurelia. A man who's killed, a man who's broken, a man whose body is giving out and whose soul died 40 years ago." The silence had stretched between them like a canyon. Then Aurelia had stepped forward, placed her hands on his chest right over his heart, and felt it pounding beneath her palms. "Your soul didn't die," she'd whispered, "because a dead man wouldn't have walked away last night. A dead man wouldn't have carved me freedom with bleeding hands. A dead man wouldn't be standing here telling me his darkest truths so I can make a real choice." "Aurelia, my turn." She'd stepped back, unlacing the high collar of her wedding dress with trembling fingers. "You want me to know you? Then know me too." She'd pulled the fabric aside to show her shoulder, where a scar ran from her collarbone to her upper arm, a burn mark, old and faded, but unmistakable. "My father gave me this when I was 12. He came home drunk and I'd made dinner wrong. He put his cigar out on my skin while my mother screamed." Josiah's face had gone white with rage. My mother tried to protect me after that," Aurelia had continued, her voice steady even as tears fell. "Taught me her Mexican remedies so I could heal myself when he got violent. Taught me Spanish songs to sing while I cleaned my own wounds. When she died having my baby brother, who also died, my father blamed me. Said I should have saved them with her herbs. He drank more, gambled more. When he finally drank himself to death, I thought I'd be free." She'd laughed bitterly. "But he'd left debts. The loan shark owned everything, including me. He told me I could work in his brothel or marry a stranger out west. I chose you because one man seemed better than hundreds." She'd looked up at Josiah, this scarred giant who'd suffered more than most men could survive. "So yes, I'm young, but I'm not innocent. I know what men can do. I know how they take and take until there's nothing left. And that's why what you did last night," her voice had cracked, "that's why it broke me, because you're the first man who ever gave instead of taking." Josiah had made a sound like a wounded animal and pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest while they both wept. 40 years of loneliness meeting 19 years of survival, two broken people clinging to each other in a dusty barn as the Montana sun climbed higher. "I'll never hurt you," Josiah had whispered into her hair. "I swear on Rebecca's grave, on my son's memory, I will never raise a hand to you." "I know," Aurelia had whispered back. "That's why I'm staying." They'd stood there for a long time, just holding each other, two wounded souls finding something neither had expected, recognition, understanding, the possibility of healing. Finally, Josiah had pulled back, wiping his eyes roughly. "Your mother's remedies, for the arthritis, would you—" "Yes," Aurelia had smiled through her tears. "But I'll need herbs. Do you have a garden?" "Behind the house. Rebecca planted it. I've kept it going, but I don't know what half the plants are." "Show me." They'd walked out of the barn together into the bright morning, and Aurelia had gasped at what she'd seen. The garden was huge, beautifully maintained, filled with herbs and flowers that shouldn't have survived in Montana's harsh climate. Someone had built protective frames, covered certain plants in winter, carefully tended each one. "You did this," she'd breathed. "For 40 years you kept her garden alive." "It was all I had left of her," Josiah had said simply. Aurelia had walked through the rows, identifying plants her mother had taught her about: arnica for inflammation, willow bark for pain, lavender for the spirit. "I can make you a salve," she'd said. "It won't cure the arthritis, but it'll help. Make it easier to work." She'd turned to him. "Will you let me?" "Why would you—" "Because those hands carved me a gift," she'd said fiercely. "Because they wrote me freedom. Because they've kept a dead woman's garden alive for 40 years, and that tells me more about who you are than any scar on your body." Something had shifted in Josiah's eyes, hope, fragile and new, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground. "All right," he'd whispered. They'd spent the morning together in that garden, Aurelia gathering herbs while Josiah told her stories. About Rebecca, about his son who'd lived 10 beautiful minutes, about the ranch and the cattle and the life he'd built from grief. She'd told him about her mother's songs, about growing up caught between two worlds, Mexican and American, never quite fitting in either, about her dreams of being more than someone's property. By noon, they'd returned to the house and Aurelia had set to work in the kitchen, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, mixing them with rendered fat and beeswax to create a thick salve. The familiar motions had calmed her, connecting her to her mother across the gulf of death. When she'd finished, she'd led Josiah to a chair and knelt before him, not in submission this time, but in service, in choice. "Give me your hands," she'd said softly. He'd extended them, those massive scarred hands that had killed and built and grieved and carved. Aurelia had taken them gently, gasping at how swollen the joints were, how hot with inflammation. She'd scooped salve onto her fingers and begun working it into his skin, massaging each knuckle, each finger, feeling the bones beneath the scarred flesh. Josiah had made a sound, half groan, half sigh, and his eyes had closed. "That feels—" He'd stopped, unable to find words. "My mother used to sing while she worked," Aurelia had whispered. And then, soft and achingly beautiful, she'd begun singing in Spanish, an old lullaby about healing and hope and the morning sun burning away darkness. Tears had slipped down Josiah's weathered cheeks as this young woman sang to him in a language he didn't understand, her gentle hands easing pain he'd carried for years. When she'd finished with his hands and started to pull away, he'd caught her wrist carefully. "Don't stop," he'd whispered, his voice raw. "Please, Aurelia, don't ever stop." And she'd understood. He wasn't asking about the massage, he was asking about this, the gentleness, the care, the human connection he'd lived without for 40 years. He was asking her to stay, to keep singing, to keep touching him like he was human instead of monster, to keep choosing him when she could choose freedom. Aurelia had looked up at this 70-year-old giant whose storm-gray eyes held a vulnerability that shattered her, and she'd made her choice. She'd risen from her knees, taken his face in her salve-slick hands, and kissed him, soft and sweet and promising everything. When she'd pulled back, Josiah had stared at her like she'd performed a miracle. "You're sure?" he'd asked, his voice shaking. "Because once I won't be able to let you go. I know that's selfish, but I've been alone so long, and you're the first light I've seen in 40 years, and teach me," Aurelia had whispered, echoing her words from the barn. "Show me what 40 years of loneliness feels like so I can help you heal it. Let me in, Josiah, all the way in." He'd stood slowly, this mountain of a man, and swept her into his arms like she weighed nothing. Carried her through the house to that bedroom where she'd sobbed the night before. Laid her on the bed with a reverence that made her breath catch. And then, with hands that still smelled like her mother's healing herbs, he'd shown her what it meant to be cherished instead of taken, worshipped instead of used, seen as a partner instead of property. The days that followed that morning became a rhythm Aurelia had never known existed. Waking beside Josiah as golden light spilled through the windows, his arm heavy and warm across her waist, proof that the night before hadn't been a dream. She'd learned his body the way she'd learned her mother's herbs, discovering that the scars told stories, that his hands could be gentle despite their size, that a 70-year-old man could make a 19-year-old girl feel things she'd never imagined possible. Not just physical pleasure, though, that had surprised her with its intensity, but something deeper, safety, partnership, the bone-deep certainty that she mattered. But the world outside their ranch had other ideas about what their union meant. 3 weeks after their wedding, Aurelia had ridden into Redemption Ridge with Josiah to buy supplies. She'd felt the stares immediately, the way conversations stopped when she entered the general store, the way women pulled their children closer as if her Mexican blood was contagious, the way men looked at her with a mixture of pity and something darker. The banker, Cornelius Blackwood, had approached them at the feed store, his thin lips twisted in a smile that never reached his cold eyes. "Thornton," he'd said, ignoring Aurelia completely. "Heard you took yourself a mail-order bride. Quite young, isn't she? Must be hard on a man your age, keeping up with such a spirited filly." The insult had been clear, the implication that Josiah was foolish, that Aurelia was using him. Josiah's hand had tightened on her waist. "My wife is none of your concern, Blackwood." "Wife," Blackwood had laughed. "Is that what we're calling purchased goods now? Thornton, everyone knows you're losing your grip. Your hands shake so bad you can barely sign your own name. How long before you can't run that ranch? What happens to your little investment then?" Aurelia had felt Josiah's entire body go rigid, shame flooding through him, because Blackwood had struck at his deepest fear, that his failing body would leave her vulnerable, that she'd regret choosing him. She'd stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Mr. Blackwood, I own 50% of the Thornton Ranch by legal deed. My husband made me an equal partner. So if you have business concerns, you can direct them to me as well." Blackwood's eyes had narrowed. A deed can be contested, especially if there's question about the mental competence of the person who signed it. Old age does terrible things to a man's judgment, makes him do foolish things, sign away his life's work to a pretty face. The threat had hung in the air like poison. Josiah had pulled Aurelia toward the door, but she'd seen the defeat in his shoulders, the way Blackwood's words had burrowed into his soul. That night, he'd been distant, pulling away when she'd reached for him. "He's right," Josiah had said, staring out the window at the darkness. "I'm an old fool who's going to leave you with nothing but trouble." "Stop," Aurelia had forced him to look at her. "That man wants your land. He's trying to drive a wedge between us. Don't let him." But the damage had been done. Over the following weeks, more whispers reached them. The doctor who'd examined Josiah for arthritis had been seen having drinks with Blackwood. The preacher who'd married them had started asking pointed questions about whether Aurelia had been coerced. The ranch hands looked at Josiah with pity, at Aurelia with suspicion. Then, on a morning that started like any other, everything fell apart. Aurelia had woken to find Josiah's side of the bed empty, which was unusual. He always waited for her to wake, touching her face like he couldn't believe she was real. She'd found him in the kitchen, fully dressed, his face gray with pain. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold his coffee cup. "Josiah?" She'd rushed to him. "What's wrong?" "Bad night," he'd managed. "The arthritis, it's worse." But it was more than that. She could see it in his eyes, fear, deep and consuming, that his body was betraying him, that he was becoming the burden Blackwood had predicted. She'd spent the morning applying salves, making him rest, singing her mother's songs while massaging his swollen joints. By afternoon, he'd improved enough to insist on checking the cattle in the north pasture. Aurelia had gone with him, refusing to let him ride alone. They'd been gone less than an hour when they'd returned to find 3 horses tied outside their house. Blackwood stood on their porch, flanked by Dr. Morrison and a man Aurelia didn't recognize, thin, official-looking, carrying a leather case. Behind them, 2 ranch hands watched with guilty faces. "Thornton," Blackwood had called out, his voice dripping false concern. "We need to talk. It's come to our attention that you may not be fit to manage your affairs. Dr. Morrison has documented your declining mental state." "My what?" Josiah had climbed down from his horse, fury radiating from him. "The arthritis has progressed to your brain," Dr. Morrison had said smoothly, pulling out papers. "Confusion, memory loss, impaired judgment. The fact that you signed away half your ranch to a teenager you'd just met is clear evidence of—" "I knew exactly what I was doing," Josiah had growled. "Did you?" The thin man had stepped forward. "Mr. Thornton, I'm Harold Sims' attorney. Mr. Blackwood has filed a petition to have you declared mentally incompetent. If the court agrees, your business dealings, including the deed you gave Mrs. Thornton, will be voided. For your own protection, of course." Aurelia had felt the ground drop out from under her. This was it. This was Blackwood's play. Declare Josiah incompetent, void the deed, take control of the ranch. She'd lose everything, her home, her partnership, her husband. "You can't do this," she'd said, her voice shaking. Blackwood had finally looked at her, his smile vicious. "Actually, my dear, we can, especially given the questionable nature of your relationship. A 19-year-old Mexican mail-order bride convincing a 70-year-old man to sign over his property? It looks very much like elder exploitation. There are laws against that." "Get off my land." Josiah's voice had been deadly quiet. "We'll be going," Blackwood had said, "but we'll be back with the sheriff in a court order. Enjoy your last few days here, Thornton. Try not to sign away anything else to your little investment." He'd looked at Aurelia. "As for you, sweetheart, I'd start packing, because when this is done, you'll have nothing, just like you started." They'd ridden away, leaving Josiah and Aurelia standing in the dust. Aurelia had watched her husband's face crumble, watched 40 years of strength crack and reveal the terrified old man underneath. "I've ruined you," he'd whispered. "I brought you here, and now they're going to take everything, and you'll end up worse than you started." "No," Aurelia had grabbed his face, forced him to look at her. "We fight this. We go to the territorial court. We show them the deed is legal." "With what evidence? A senile old man who can barely hold a pen some days, a purchased bride who has every reason to manipulate him?" Josiah had pulled away. "They're right, Aurelia. I'm failing. My body's giving out. I can't protect you from this." "Then I'll protect us." She'd stood tall, channeling every ounce of her mother's strength. "I'm not the scared girl who arrived here a month ago. I'm a woman who owns half a ranch, who has a husband worth fighting for. And I will not let that snake Blackwood take what's ours." But that night, despite her brave words, Aurelia had lain awake wondering if it was enough. If love could survive when the whole world was determined to tear them apart, if a 19-year-old girl and a 70-year-old man could build something real when everyone saw only a transaction. The answer came 3 days later, at dawn, when Aurelia woke to an empty bed and a note on Josiah's pillow written in his shaking handwriting. My dearest Aurelia, I cannot watch them destroy you to get to me. I'm going to Blackwood this morning to sign the ranch over to him. In return, he's agreed to give you $5,000 in safe passage wherever you want to go. It's not what you deserve, but it's the best I can do. You were right that first night. You're too young to handle this, too young to be tied to a broken old man who can't protect what's his. Forgive me for being selfish enough to let you stay this long. The past month has been the happiest of my life. I'll carry it to my grave. Love, Josiah. Aurelia had read it 3 times before the words sank in. Then she'd screamed, a sound of pure rage that sent birds flying from the rafters. He was giving up, surrendering, trying to save her by sacrificing himself. And didn't he understand that she didn't want saving if it meant losing him? She'd dressed faster than she ever had, grabbed the deed from the desk where Josiah kept it, and ridden hell for leather toward town. The sun was barely up, painting the mountains gold and pink, and all she could think was, please God, let me be in time. She'd found them in Blackwood's office, Josiah seated across from the banker, new papers spread on the desk, a pen in his shaking hand. Through the window she'd seen him poised to sign, saw Blackwood's triumphant smirk, saw her entire future about to disappear. Aurelia had kicked open that door like an avenging angel, the deed clutched in her fist, her dark eyes blazing. Don't you dare, she'd said, her voice ringing with authority. Don't you dare sign those papers, Josiah Thornton. Josiah had looked up, shock and anguish warring on his face. Aurelia, you don't understand. I understand that you're trying to protect me by destroying yourself, she had said, stalking toward him. I understand that you think loving me means letting me go, but you're wrong. She'd slammed the deed down on Blackwood's desk. This deed is legal, signed by a man of sound mind who was giving his wife a partnership, not a handout. And if you, she'd pointed at Blackwood, want to challenge it in court, you better have real evidence of incompetence, because I've got a month of witnesses who've seen Josiah run this ranch better than any man half his age. Mrs. Thornton, Blackwood had said smoothly, you're young. You don't understand business. I understand theft when I see it. Aurelia had leaned across the desk. You want that ranch because it sits on the best water rights in the county. You've wanted it for years, but Josiah wouldn't sell, so you're trying to steal it by destroying his reputation. Well, here's what's going to happen. We're leaving. We're going to the territorial judge in Helena, and we're going to show him exactly what kind of man you are. She'd turned to Josiah, this broken giant who'd given her everything and thought it wasn't enough. Get up, she'd commanded. We're going home, together, because I didn't beg you never to stop touching me just so you could walk away when things got hard. Josiah had stared at her like she was the second coming. Then, slowly, he'd stood, leaving Blackwood's papers unsigned. You're sure? He'd asked, his voice breaking. Because if we fight this, they'll drag your name through mud, call you things that'll hurt. Let them, Aurelia had said fiercely. I've been called worse. What matters is what you call me. Partner, wife, equal. That's worth fighting for. They'd walked out of that office together, leaving Blackwood sputtering threats about courts and sheriffs. On the ride home, Josiah had finally broken down, pulling her from her horse onto his, holding her while they sat there in the middle of the road. I'm scared, he'd admitted. I'm 70 years old and I'm scared of failing you. Then we'll fail together, Aurelia had said. But we won't quit. Not on each other. Not on this. The court battle had lasted 3 months. Blackwood had brought doctors who testified about Josiah's failing health. The prosecutor had painted Aurelia as a gold digger who'd seduced a lonely old man. The newspapers had called their marriage a scandal, a mockery, a transaction masquerading as love. But Aurelia had stood in that courtroom and told the truth. About the cedar box carved with bleeding hands, about the freedom papers, about a man who'd walked away from his wedding night because he valued her dignity over his desires. She'd brought the ranch hands who testified that Josiah's mind was sharp as ever. She'd shown the judge the garden Josiah had maintained for 40 years. She'd proven that their partnership was real. And when the judge had ruled in their favor, declaring the deed valid and dismissing Blackwood's petition, Aurelia had collapsed in Josiah's arms while the courtroom erupted around them. Now, 6 months later, Aurelia stood in that same garden where Rebecca's flowers grew, one hand resting on her stomach where new life was growing. Impossible, miraculous, terrifying. She'd tell Josiah tonight, she'd decided. Tell him that the 70-year-old rancher and his 19-year-old bride were going to have a baby. Tell him that sometimes miracles came wrapped in scandal and controversy and love that the world couldn't understand. She heard his footsteps behind her, felt his arms wrap around her waist, his chin resting on her head. His hands didn't shake as much anymore. Her salves and massages had helped, but more than that, having something to live for had healed him in ways medicine never could. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice rumbling through his chest into her back. "About how I was too young to handle this," Aurelia said softly, "but I did it anyway." "We both did." Josiah turned her in his arms, and in his storm-gray eyes she saw everything. Grief transformed into joy, loneliness replaced by belonging, the past 40 years of darkness finally giving way to light. "Thank you," he whispered, "for staying, for fighting, for teaching an old man what love really means." Aurelia smiled and pulled his hand to her stomach, holding it there. "Then get ready, Josiah Thornton, because I'm about to teach you something else." She watched understanding dawn in his eyes, watched shock give way to wonder, give way to tears, and as he dropped to his knees in that garden, pressing his face against her stomach, weeping with joy while she sang her mother's Spanish lullabies, Aurelia knew that this impossible, scandalous, beautiful thing they'd built was worth every fight, every judgment, every moment of doubt. Sometimes the world called it wrong, but between them, it was everything right. The mail-order bride who'd sobbed, "I'm too young to handle this," had handled it all. And by morning, by evening, by every moment in between, she'd never stopped begging the 70-year-old rancher to keep loving her exactly the way he did, with bleeding hands, broken walls, and a heart that had waited 40 years to beat again. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another epic tale of love that defies all odds. Because sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones the world says shouldn't exist.